When Donald Trump joked about buying Greenland, people around the world laughed. It sounded like another wild idea from a president known for shocking headlines. But to America's allies, that moment revealed something deeper, a glimpse of how Washington was starting to see the world, not through friendship, but through ownership. Then came another remark, that Canada might as well be America's 51st state. This time, Canadians didn't laugh. To them, it wasn't just a joke. It was a reminder that the U.S. often forgets its neighbor is a country, not a province waiting for permission. That sense of disrespect didn't stop there. It showed up in trade wars, tariffs, and constant jabs at NATO, the very alliance built on trust. What was once a dependable partnership started to look more like a one-sided deal. And that's the backdrop for today's standoff. What began as jokes and insults has now turned into something far bigger, a fight over fighter jets, defense money, and who really calls the shots in North America. Because when a friendship starts feeling like control, even a quiet country like Canada eventually pushes back. For decades, the US and Canada were like two gears in the same machine, different sizes, but moving in sync. They traded freely, defended each other through NORAD and NATO, and shared one of the longest peaceful borders in the world. Canada relied on the US for markets, security, and even cultural influence. And in return, America counted on Canada as its most stable and polite ally. But under Trump, that balance started to crack. Tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum hit like a slap in the face. It wasn't just about money, it was about respect. Canada had fought beside the U.S. in every major war since World War I. To suddenly be treated as a threat to American industry felt insulting. Then came the public mocking of NATO, the trade fights with allies, and the America First policies that ignored long-standing agreements. For many Canadians, it became clear that Washington no longer looked like a steady partner. It looked unpredictable, even hostile. This shift wasn't just political, it was emotional. Canadians who grew up seeing the U.S. as a friendly giant began to see it as a bully throwing its weight around. And while politicians debated how to respond, ordinary people started quietly changing their behavior. Not with protests or slogans, but with something much more powerful: their choices. When the F-35 was first introduced, it wasn't just another fighter jet, it was marketed as the future of modern warfare. The U.S. called it the most advanced aircraft ever built, stealthy, lightning fast, packed with sensors, and nearly invisible to radar. It could share data across battlefields, track multiple targets, and carry out missions no other plane could. Lockheed Martin executives proudly described it as the backbone of Western defense for decades to come. The message to allies like Canada was clear. If you wanted to stay relevant, if you wanted your military to truly belong to the future, you needed the F-35. On paper, it sounded perfect. One plane that could serve the Air Force, Navy, Marines, and dozens of allied nations. It would make everyone compatible, connected, and ready for whatever threat came next. It wasn't just a fighter. It was a symbol of belonging to America's inner circle of defense. So, when Canada began reconsidering its options, Washington didn't treat it as a business decision. It treated it like betrayal. Officials warned that if Ottawa backed away from the F-35, it could even put NORAD, the very alliance designed to protect both countries, at risk. That wasn't salesmanship anymore. That was pressure. And for many Canadians, it revealed something uncomfortable. This deal wasn't just about defense. It was about control. The deeper Canada looked into the F-35 deal, the more it realized something didn't add up. The jet that was supposed to be a symbol of efficiency and unity was turning into a bottomless pit of cost overruns and technical failures. At first, Lockheed Martin promised a price tag that seemed manageable, about $75 million per plane. But by the time Canada examined the real numbers, estimates had exploded to more than $180 million per aircraft once maintenance, upgrades, and lifetime operation were factored in. That wasn't all. The F-35 was supposed to be stealthy, but reports surfaced that its radar signature wasn't as invisible as advertised. Its software, made up of more than 8 million lines of code, was riddled with bugs. Some pilots complained that the cockpit's advanced helmet display was glitchy and even dangerous, and the cost of staying compatible with the US kept rising. Every software update, every repair, every replacement part had to come through American contractors. Canada would never truly own the jets. It would just rent access to America's defense technology. By 2022, Canadian officials quietly began asking, if this is the future, why does it feel like a trap? The public started turning skeptical. Analysts pointed out that European jets like the Swedish Gripen or the French Rafale were cheaper, easier to maintain, and offered far more local control. Even Japan and South Korea were beginning to produce competitive models. The illusion of the F-35 as the only option began to fall apart. And that's when the real shift in Canadian defense thinking began. When Trump doubled down on his 25% auto tariffs, it wasn't just a trade move, it was a wake-up call. Canada realized that its entire economy, from cars to energy, could be held hostage by political mood swings in Washington. That moment changed everything. Behind closed doors, Canadian defense planners began exploring alternatives, quietly at first, then more openly. Instead of waiting for American approval, Ottawa started looking to Europe and Asia for new deals. Sweden, France, and even South Korea emerged as serious partners. These countries weren't just offering fighter jets. They were offering something America no longer guaranteed: respect and independence. In 2023, a proposal landed on the table that shocked Washington. Canada was considering the Saab Gripen E, a European-made fighter that was cheaper, just as capable, and could be maintained with far fewer restrictions. It symbolized something deeper, a shift away from automatic dependence on the US. At the same time, Canada began strengthening ties with NATO's European wing, joining more exercises with France, Germany, and Norway. On the Pacific side, it expanded cooperation with Japan and South Korea, both key US allies, but in a way that allowed Canada to stand on its own feet. This was more than strategy, it was identity. Canada was redefining what kind of country it wanted to be in a world that no longer revolved around American leadership. The US media barely noticed at first, but defense insiders did. They saw a subtle realignment taking shape, one that could rewrite decades of North American cooperation. When Canada began pushing back against Washington's trade aggression, the consequences rippled far beyond the defense industry. The United States tariffs on autos, aluminum, and steel triggered a tit-for-tat response from Ottawa. Canada struck back with its own tariffs on American goods, from agricultural products to household brands, marking the start of a cold economic war between two countries that once prided themselves on open borders. At first, many thought Canada couldn't afford to fight back. After all, nearly 3/4 of Canadian exports traditionally went to the United States. But something surprising happened. The diversification strategy started to work. Canadian companies began expanding into Europe through the CETA trade deal and into Asia through the CPTPP agreement. Exports to Japan, South Korea, and Singapore rose sharply. Still, the shift came with pain. Auto factories in Ontario faced uncertainty as supply chains stretched and costs rose. Thousands of jobs hung in the balance, especially in communities built around cross-border manufacturing. American companies, too, started to feel the pressure, since so many United States parts depend on Canadian steel, aluminum, and energy. Farmers, truckers, and small business owners on both sides of the border suddenly realized how deeply connected the two economies were. What had once been a seamless system of cooperation was now tangled in tariffs, delays, and rising prices. Yet for many Canadians, the cost was worth it. For the first time in decades, the country was asserting itself not as a junior partner, but as an independent power capable of choosing its own path. even if that meant economic turbulence. And as those shifts took hold, another question emerged. Could Canada actually thrive without depending on the United States economy at all? As tensions with Washington grew, Canada started weaving a new web of partnerships across the world, ones built not on geography, but on shared interests. In Europe, Ottawa deepened its defense and trade ties with France, Germany, and Sweden. These weren't just polite diplomatic gestures. They were strategic moves. France, for example, opened talks with Canada on joint Arctic patrols, a sign that Europe was taking Canada's northern strength seriously. Sweden offered technology sharing on the Gripen jet program, giving Canada something it hadn't had under the F-35 deal: real control over its own defense equipment. Meanwhile, in Asia, Canada turned its attention to Japan and South Korea. Both nations were quietly building advanced military technology and wanted trustworthy partners outside the US-China rivalry. Canada fit perfectly, a democratic, resource-rich nation with global credibility. Even India entered the picture. With its growing energy needs and defense ambitions, New Delhi saw Canada as a potential supplier and collaborator. For Ottawa, this was a golden opportunity to connect with the global South, a world that was fast rising while the old Western order struggled with division. By 2025, trade missions and joint exercises painted a new map of Canadian influence. The country was no longer orbiting the U.S. It was anchoring itself in a multipolar world. Critics in Washington saw this as betrayal, but for Canadians, it was about balance, not rebellion. They had learned that overdependence on one superpower meant vulnerability. Now, they were spreading their bets across many: Europe for defense, Asia for trade, Africa for resources, and Latin America for collaboration. The shift was quiet, calculated, and irreversible. Washington did not take Canada's pivot lightly. What started as quiet irritation quickly turned into strategic concern. For decades, the U.S. had counted on Canada as a loyal partner, a reliable supplier of raw materials, a key ally in NORAD, and a supportive voice in NATO. Losing even part of that loyalty threatened to unravel an entire security framework built since World War II. Behind closed doors, U.S. officials began pressuring Ottawa to reconsider its growing ties with Europe and Asia. Defense briefings framed Canada's new independence as a risk to continental security. Trade negotiators hinted that future access to American markets could depend on political alignment. But the more the U.S. pushed, the more Canada resisted. Prime Minister Mark Carney, known for his calm but firm diplomacy, made it clear that Canada would no longer make decisions based solely on American approval. Partnership, he said in one speech, is not ownership. That phrase went viral across Canada. It summed up a national mood, one that had quietly grown for years. People were tired of being the younger brother in North America. They wanted equality, not obedience. The American media reacted sharply. Some commentators accused Canada of abandoning the West. Others warned that China and Russia could exploit the divide. But what they missed was the bigger story. Canada wasn't siding against anyone. It was simply stepping out from behind America's shadow. And that realization, that Washington could no longer automatically count on its northern neighbor, marked a true turning point in the power balance of the Western world. The split between Canada and the U.S. didn't happen overnight, but once it began, the ripple effects were impossible to ignore. The old North American model of total economic and defense integration was being rewritten in real time. First, the auto industry, once the backbone of cross-border cooperation, began to fracture. U.S. automakers that relied on Canadian aluminum and batteries faced new costs and delays. Canadian companies, in turn, shifted production toward Europe and Asia, building new supply lines that bypassed Detroit entirely. Then came energy. For decades, Canadian oil and electricity flowed south almost automatically. But now, with new deals in Asia and Europe, that pattern started to change. Canada invested billions in Pacific export terminals to ship liquefied natural gas to Japan and South Korea, countries hungry for stable, democratic energy partners. Even in technology and research, cooperation cooled. The two nations that once shared labs and innovation projects began to drift apart. Canadian universities started signing research pacts with European institutions, while the U.S. tightened technology export rules in response. But out of this disruption came something powerful, a new sense of sovereignty. For the first time in generations, Canada wasn't waiting for American approval to act on the world stage. It was crafting its own identity as a global middle power bridging East and West, North and South. For the U.S., the split served as a warning. Even its closest allies could drift away if treated as dependents instead of equals. And for the rest of the world, it signaled something bigger, that the post-Cold War world of American dominance was truly ending. A new age of distributed power was emerging, with Canada standing as one of its first architects. For over a century, Canada and the United States moved like twins, bound by trade, geography, and history. But as this new chapter unfolds, it's clear that era is ending. What we're witnessing isn't just a policy disagreement or a temporary rift. It's a fundamental shift in global alignment. Trump's 25% tariffs didn't just hit cars or aluminum. They hit something deeper: trust. They reminded Canada that dependence, even on a friendly neighbor, can become a weakness when politics change. From that moment, Canada made a quiet but historic choice to stop defining itself by proximity to America and to start defining itself by purpose, to trade more widely, to defend more independently, to speak with its own voice on the global stage. That choice is reshaping everything, from energy routes and defense pacts to trade corridors and diplomacy. And though it began as a reaction to U.S. pressure, it has grown into something larger, a statement of identity. In a world breaking away from old powers, Canada has positioned itself not as a follower, but as a builder, crafting connections between continents, ideas, and futures. So when historians look back, they might not see this as the end of the U.S.-Canada alliance. They might see it as the moment it evolved, from dependency into equality, from loyalty into leadership. Because sometimes, the only way to save a partnership is to stop being afraid of standing alone.